Welcome back to The Shed. Tonight, I want to take a look at the multi-award-winning novel by China Mieville, The City and the City. So this novel won the Hugo in 2010. It co-won the Hugo with Paolo Bacigalupi's The Wind-Up Girl. Now, what was interesting about 2010 is that it was a really interesting year because both novels took those fantasy and science fiction themes and sort of blended them together, which was not really fantasy or fiction. And this novel is right along those lines. It's regarded as weird fiction, a branch of speculative fiction, which science fiction is a part of. So it's an interesting novel, and what I would like to do is provide a bit of a plot overview, being careful not to provide any spoilers, because I think a lot of what makes this book really interesting is the way these cities work. So I will be providing a bit of a plot overview. I'll talk to what I liked, what I didn't like. I'll put it to the memory test and we'll go rank it on our ever-growing sci-fi shed ladder where I've been ranking all these great Hugo and or Nebula award-winning novels. And I've got a feeling it's going to be pretty difficult to rank this one. So Theodore Bourlou is a detective in the city Basel. And it's a rather interesting city, Basel. And what we find is that he's investigating the murder of a young foreign exchange student called Mahalia Giri. And Mahalia, it appears, seems to have gotten herself into a bit of hot water because of her political and cultural views. So much so that she took refuge back in Oklahoma, a twin city of Basel. And she's not quite sure what's going on there, but something's occurred. She's either had to flee back to Basel, but she's been murdered in the process. So Bourlou is investigating this murder, and he's had to go and work with his counterpart in Oklahoma, another detective there, because there's some very interesting border and geographical differences between these cities. So this is really a murder mystery novel following that police procedural type element that we find in the likes of Ed McBain. And we've covered Ed McBain not for his not for his police procedural documents, but one of his great science fiction novels. But I will be covering Ed McBain in the future, one of his police procedurals, because there's a really interesting writer which I want to get back to. So anyway, Bourlou's investigating this murder, trying to get to exactly what led to Mahalia's demise, working with his counterpart in Oklahoma, also working with a female detective in Basel who's trying to provide some info. And all the while we find out the deep mystery that seems to be surrounding Mahalia, because there's talk of all these dark secret societies, conspiracy theories, and Bourlou needs to navigate through all this forest of trees to understand exactly what the truth is. So look, it's a very interesting novel, and I'm going to leave the plot at that because I've seen a lot of written reviews and I've seen a lot of video reviews in the past, but I think saying any more to what makes Basel and Oklahoma such a fascinating concept really does take away from the enjoyment of this novel. So if you haven't watched the novel yet, so if you haven't read the novel yet, I'll leave it at that. Take it as a weird blend of fantasy and science fiction. I'd say it would lend itself more to science fiction, but it is categorized as weird fiction. So it's speculative in many ways, and you can read into those twin cities in many different ways. But at least, needless to say, it is a murder mystery novel that takes that police procedural element and brings it into this weird fantasy fiction top realm. Very, very, very interesting concept. So what did I like? Look, I think the concept of those two twin cities and what makes them unique is a standout for me. And I think a standout for anyone who's actually read this novel. Now, I don't want to talk to that like I'm sort of mentioned in my plot overview, because what makes it really interesting is that build-up. And as you're reading through the novel, you're starting to learn the mechanics of these twin cities and how they operate and what makes them unique. So much so that I think talking about any more than that takes away from the full enjoyment you may otherwise get from reading this novel. So I'd have to say conceptually, I think this novel was brilliant. I really liked that concept. Very, very thought-provoking and very interesting concept. The other thing that I really enjoy for my personal taste, is that police procedural murder mystery novels. I'm a big fan of that genre, and I do like it when it comes up in science fiction. I mentioned so when we did The Demolished Man. It was that reverse murder mystery novel. We knew who the murderer was, and it was about gathering all the evidence together to make a case. And we saw elements of that in Anne Leckie's A Memory Called Empire as well. So I do like that novel, that genre of novels, that murder mystery, police procedural type novel, and this was a classic for that. I thought the story and the plot was well done. I've seen criticisms online, but I didn't find that myself. I thought the plot was interesting. I didn't think it was quite obvious as to who the murderer was. I'll leave it at that again, not to take away from your reading pleasure, but I thought the plot was intricate enough, and I think that it had you guessing for a long way through the novel as to exactly what's happening here. So I thought that indeed was well done. The other thing I enjoyed is that talk of conspiracy and secret societies. I mean, who doesn't like to delve into secret societies and conspiracy theories? And there was a really interesting element of that when it comes to these twin cities and how they operated that I thought made it interesting. And it also talked to people's biases, right? Sometimes people just want to believe what they're already believing, right? So and sort of ignore the evidence. And I sort of enjoyed the way China Mieville sort of tackled that subject, which I thought was rather well done and very interesting as well. So look, a lot to like when it comes to the concepts. Look, the things that I didn't like, and I've got to be completely honest with you. Now, I'm a big fan of China Mieville. I really enjoyed Perdido Street Station, and I really liked Rousey by China Mieville. Really interesting novels, which I may cover at some point in the future on this channel. So interesting novels, and I am a fan of China Mieville's writing, but I got to say, sometimes the prose in this particular novel just threw me off a bit. I think it was just, I don't know, sometimes I found myself having to read dialogue multiple times just to understand, what are you talking about? I couldn't follow some of the dialogue, and I'm not sure if I'm alone in that, but several times I was reading through a bit of dialogue and I was thinking, what are you talking about? I'm just not making any sense of this. And I read it a couple of times, and most times when I reread it, I was okay. But there was one or two instances where even after rereading it, I thought, I don't know what you mean. I'm not quite sure what you're talking about. So that was a real big negative for me. Look, it might be a personal thing. I'd love to hear your opinions, but I just did find at times that the prose was just a bit off, and it just had me not quite understanding exactly what the author meant by some of that dialogue. But look, that only happened a couple of times, and generally speaking, it was a very well-written novel. Look, I really enjoyed the concept, but one of the big gaping holes was why. I love the novel. I'm a really big fan, and again, I'm just preparing myself, being extra critical because I need to rank this thing on a sci-fi shed ladder. So I'm really trying to be transparent, emphasizing some of the things that took away from my reading pleasure, but it should not really be deterring you from reading this great novel. At least I hope it doesn't. But one of the things that I didn't quite understand is there's a really interesting mechanics beyond these two cities, right? And I'll leave it at that. But it was never really explained. Like, and without trying to give spoilers away, you think, but why? Why do these cities behave this way? Why are the citizens forced to behave in this particular manner? Who governs, and why do they govern it the way they do? What authority do they have? Why, right? There's just a big question mark as to brilliant concept. I really enjoyed this, but why? And the why was never answered. And I think it would make a really great sequel, and maybe China will get around to it one day, because I really would love to see a sequel that maybe uncovers some of these why questions for me, because I reckon the sequel will be a hot seller for anyone who's a fan of this particular novel. So when it comes to the memory test, I read this book in around about 2010, 2011, pretty much as soon as I realized it had won the Hugo. I went out and bought the book on the Kindle, and I read that novel. Now, what I was going to say is that concept, and as I started reading after 13 odd years, I was reading through the concept, and the concept was great. Like, I hadn't forgotten it. And as soon as I was reading through it, I was thinking, oh yeah, that's right. This is about those two cities and the interesting mechanics on how they operate and the boundaries and geographical wanderings of that city, right? So that was pretty obvious. As soon as I started reading it, almost by the first or second chapter, I started thinking, oh yeah, that's right. China Mieville is the city and the city. I remember what this is all about. So really interesting and memorable theme. But I've got to say, the characters and the plot, that murder mystery, as much as I enjoyed it, was just forgettable. I couldn't remember that this novel was a murder mystery novel. I remember the concept, but I remember nothing else about the plot, nor the characters, which I think really talks to a great summary, right, for my overall experience. Really interesting concept. Sometimes I thought that concept was too much in your face, and we get it. We probably don't need to emphasize it as much. But nevertheless, I really did enjoy those passages. The plot was interesting, and I did like that murder mystery novel. But when you read hundreds of books, I don't think it stands out, in my memory banks at least, like so many others on the board when we go to look at it. What about recommendations? Look, I think if you're a fan of those, police procedural documents, novels like Ed McBain's and others of that genre, where you're doing these murder mystery novels, I think you would thoroughly enjoy this one. I think if you have read and enjoyed The Wind-Up Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi, that won the Hugo, co-won the Hugo that year with China Mieville, I think this is a similar kind of novel. Very different in themes, but I think generally speaking, they're both very interesting novels, and I can see the similarities between the two, as far as the writing styles and the concept and that sort of speculative fiction, right, between that fantasy fiction sort of blend and not being either one of the two, which I really found that to be the case with The Wind-Up Girl as well. So I think if you enjoyed that novel, you will enjoy this one as well. Look, the other thing I would say is, if you've enjoyed books like The Demolished Man by Alfred Bester or Anne Leckie's A Memory Called Empire, that murder mystery novel with a science fiction or fantasy blend mix, then again, I would say have a go at this one because I think you'll be thoroughly impressed by it as well. The other obvious recommendation is China Mieville. So if you're a China Mieville fan and you really like Perdido Street Station, then you really ought to read this one because it is a great novel, and I think just for the concept alone was worthwhile read for me. And this time around, believe it or not, because I guess that concept did stand the test of time and I was familiar with the concept, this time around I actually enjoyed the murder mystery component more than I did the concept. I guess first impressions would be, yeah, great concept. But as a second read, I think you can take more than just a concept and walk away with a really interesting murder mystery novel to boot. Hey, we've got to rank it on our sci-fi shit ladder. Let me flip the cameras around and see if we can scrabble my brains a little bit more and find out exactly where this one goes. So I've been racking my brains for the last 10 minutes, trying to figure out exactly where we're going to rank tonight's Hugo award-winning novel for 2010 in China Mieville's The City and the City. Because it's a really interesting concept, right? Really interesting concept, but unfortunately just leaves you with the huge unanswered question, why? Right? And when I look at all the other novels on the board, I think it's gonna suffer because of that. The other thing I'd have to say as well is that the characters are interesting. I didn't find anything too bad with the characters, but they didn't really go through any real, journey of transformation. It was really, they did to some degree. You'd have to argue with Detective Bolu. It does go through some kind of character arc, which is interesting itself. But I would have to say that was not the main point of the novel. It wasn't about losing yourself in the characters. It was really that strong concept, but that concept had a huge big gaping hole for me that I think is really going to let it down. I don't think it's going to be on the bottom of the list, because on the bottom of the list we've also got some great novels like A Memory Called Empire by Anne Leckie and Ancillary Justice, the 2014 and 2020 Hugo award-winning novels. And in some ways, this novel is that sort of same period. The writing style is somewhat similar. But I'd have to say that the concept in this one was far more memorable than it was for Ancillary Justice and A Memory Called Empire. So I remember reading this book, which was a good, 4 and 10 years prior to those two novels on the board already. But I remember this concept more than I did the other two. So I'd have to say from a memory test point of view, this one surpasses those, and the concept wasn't a really interesting one, So I don't think it's going to be the bottom of the list. Nor do I think it's going to be the top of the list. I just don't think a novel, for my personal enjoyment, can have the big gaping question mark unanswered, which would make it warrant its place on the shed ladder. I mean, I could argue the same of To Your Scattered Bodies Go, right? I could argue that sort of left you with a big gaping hole. But at least there are sequels to that novel that give you some answers, which is not necessarily the case here, right? I don't think there is. I'd love to be told otherwise, but I'm not aware of a sequel to this novel. So I can't see it ranking on the A side where we have great books like The Dispossessed and The Left Hand of Darkness, and bottoming out on the A side is Stranger in a Strange Land, which is just such a memorable novel and such a controversial and significant novel in the genre. So it's not going to make the A side. So I thought, let's go back to the middle of the bunch and see where it's going to sit. Now I want to look at The Wind-Up Girl by Paolo Bacigalupi because it's a very similar novel like I alluded to in my overview. But I'd have to say The Wind-Up Girl's writing was better. I enjoyed the writing, Paolo Bacigalupi's writing, more than I did China Mieville's. I think conceptually this novel was a better concept. They had very big similarities, like I said, with the fantasy and fiction blend. But I gotta say, the writing in The Wind-Up Girl, I remember reading that book and just really enjoying the writing, and the concept was good enough to keep me engaged for what is a book that is pretty large as well, right? So I'm going to have to just give the slight edge to The Wind-Up Girl because it didn't leave any real unanswered questions, and I thought the characters were interesting enough and the plot was interesting enough. Red Shirts, I've mentioned in the past, very memorable novel for me. So I couldn't rank it above Red Shirts. Flowers for Algernon, just a classic, such a beautifully written novel. So I couldn't rank it above that. And I'm not going to justify every other placing on here, but maybe start at the bottom this time and work our way up. Is The City and the City better than Babel 17? And I'm going to have to say it is. I like Babel 17, and the concept was good. It was a good concept, a strong concept. But I've got to say I did enjoy The City and the City more than I did Babel 17 overall. I think the characters are interesting, and I do like that murder mystery novel. So I'm going to give the edge to China Mieville. I'm going to say the same with Man Plus as well. Man Plus was a good novel, but I just don't think it was quite to the caliber that we saw with Gateway. And I'm going to give the edge to China Mieville because the concept, again, I think was just stronger than it was in Man Plus. And for me, a much more memorable novel, which then takes me to Startide Rising. And I've left a gap in here, so I think you're going to pretty much guess where it is. And it is going to sit just below Startide Rising. I liked the concept of the uplift in Startide Rising. I made some criticisms around those dolphins and flying spaceships that I couldn't quite get over that mental hurdle. But I gotta say, it's a very good concept. It left no stones unturned. The writing was at times a bit padded out, but at least I understood every single bit of dialogue, and I didn't have to reread anything to really understand and get the full enjoyment of the novel. So I had difficulties raising it above Startide Rising. And it seems to be a bit of a follow-up theme lately. The City and the City, really interesting concept, but I think it just lacked a little in execution. The characters were not quite on par, but everything else I would have to say was a pretty decent novel. So that's where it's going to sit tonight. Potentially controversial because it was a really interesting novel and I enjoyed it overall. Again, one of those things I say almost every single week. These are all great novels and I think it's a very enjoyable novel that you ought to read. But that's where it's going to sit tonight. Are you a big China Mieville fan? Did you like The City and the City? Do you prefer it over Perdido Street Station? I'll need to review that book because it's been years since I last read it. But that's where we're going to sit tonight. I'd love to get your input as always. And thank you for spending time with me in the shed. And I'll see you next time in the shed.